$85,000. Rick Harrison, the king of the lowball deal, just overpaid on purpose. Why would the master negotiator abandon his rules for a weathered guitar case? Inside, a 1941 Gibson SJ200 once played by Stephen Stills, a double Hall of Famer. This wasn't just an instrument. It was a ghost from America's musical past. And in that moment, Rick wasn't a businessman. He was a man confronting something he'd lost long ago. Tonight, we uncover the story behind the deal television never showed. The 1941 Gibson legend. To understand why this moment mattered, you need to understand what a 1941 Gibson SJ200 actually represents. Gibson introduced the SJ200 in 1938, calling it the Jumbo model. It was without question the most ambitious, most beautifully crafted guitar the company had ever produced. And the SJ200 was designed for performers who demanded perfection. Every curve, every joint, every piece of wood was selected with obsessive precision. This wasn't a guitar, this was a statement. Gibson poured everything they knew into this instrument, creating something that transcended functionality and entered the realm of art. The craftsmen who built these guitars understood they were creating heirlooms. The tone wood was aged and selected with care that borders on spiritual. The inlays were hand-cut. The binding was applied by workers who had spent years learning their trade. In an era before mass production consumed everything, the SJ200 represented the pinnacle of what human hands could achieve when given the freedom to pursue excellence without compromise. Then history intervened. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II, and everything changed. Gibson, like every American manufacturer, pivoted to support the war effort. Guitar production stopped. The SJ200 became a relic of a world that no longer existed. The factory floors that had echoed with the sounds of instruments being born fell silent, replaced by the machinery of war. The math is devastating for collectors. Gibson only produced the SJ200 from 1938 until the war shut everything down. That means only a few dozen of these instruments were ever created. Maybe less. Finding one today is like finding a message in a bottle from a ship that sank 80 years ago. Most were played until they fell apart. Others were lost to fires, floods, and the simple erosion of time. The survivors became whispered legends in the guitar community, holy grails that collectors spent lifetimes pursuing. When guitar expert Jesse Amoroso examined the instrument Landon brought in, his hands moved with the reverence of an archaeologist handling ancient artifacts. He checked the joints. He ran his fingers along the grain of the wood. He played a few notes and listened to the resonance of an instrument that had been vibrating with music since before most people's grandparents were born. His assessment was immediate. As a vintage guitar alone, ignoring everything else about its history, this 1941 Gibson SJ200 was worth between $75,000 and $90,000. Just for the wood and the craftsmanship and the impossibility of its survival. But then came the part that transformed this from a rare find into something approaching legend. The legend attached. Stephen Stills didn't just play guitar, he rewrote the rules of what American rock music could be. With Buffalo Springfield, he helped invent the sound of the late 60s. With Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, he created Deja Vu, an album that Rolling Stone would later rank among the greatest ever recorded. The man was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice in a single ceremony, once for Buffalo Springfield and once for CSNY. That almost never happens. It means the industry recognized that he didn't just make good music, He fundamentally altered the trajectory of music itself. And here's what made this guitar extraordinary. Stills was still alive. He was still touring. This wasn't a historical artifact from a closed chapter of history. And this was a living connection to a legend who could theoretically walk into that pawn shop and be interviewed. The guitar wasn't just old, it was alive with meaning. Landon didn't just have the guitar either. He had documentation. A signed bill of sale from Stephen Stills himself. Paper trail proving beyond any doubt that this instrument had been owned and played by one of rock's greatest musicians. Jesse Amoroso calculated that the Stills connection added another $20,000 to $30,000 to the guitar's value. Total appraisal, somewhere between $95,000 and $120,000 for a guitar, an instrument made of wood and metal and strings that could produce sound. Rick Harrison stared at those numbers, and something inside him shifted. Tore history in his hands. What's supposed to happen at the gold and silver pawn shop? Someone walks in with an item. They think it's worth a certain amount. Rick Harrison, armed with decades of experience and an encyclopedic knowledge of collectibles, explains why it's actually worth less. Then he makes an offer so low it's almost insulting. The seller pushes back. They haggle. Eventually, they meet somewhere in the middle, with Rick always walking away, having paid significantly less than the item's actual value. That's the formula. That's how Rick Harrison built his empire. It's a dance he's performed thousands of times, and he's become the undisputed master. But Landon wasn't a desperate seller looking to unload a family heirloom to pay medical bills. He was a serious collector who knew exactly what he had. His asking price was $110,000, right in the middle of the expert appraisal. Fair. Reasonable. The kind of opening number that leaves very little room for Rick's usual tactics. Landon had done his homework. He understood the market. He wasn't going to be intimidated or manipulated. Rick brought in his team. He asked about the documentation. He examined the bill of sale. He studied the condition of the wood and the repairs that had been made over 8 decades. He was doing what he always does: thorough due diligence, calculated assessment. But something else was happening underneath the surface. Something the cameras caught that Rick probably didn't intend to show. He was conflicted. Genuinely, deeply conflicted in a way that rarely surfaces on television. Watch the footage closely, and you can see it. One moment, he's the businessman, calculating profit margins and resale values. The next moment, he's something else entirely. A kid who fell in love with rare things as a teenager. A man who built an empire but lost his family in the process. Rick Harrison recently mourned the death of his son, Adam. The TV personality paid tribute on social media, but grief doesn't work on a schedule. It surfaces when you least expect it. It ambushes you in moments of quiet. It transforms ordinary objects into vessels of meaning. And here was Rick, holding an object that represented everything his empire had been trying to claim. Connection to greatness, connection to history, connection to something that actually mattered beyond dollars and profit margins. This guitar had witnessed the creation of music that shaped a generation. And it had been held by hands that changed American culture. And now it was in Rick's hands, and he had to decide what that was worth. The negotiation moved from $110,000 to $90,000, then to $95,000. Then Rick made his final offer, $85,000. Landon accepted immediately. And later, the seller revealed that $85,000 was actually higher than his bottom line. Rick Harrison, the lowball king, the man who never overpays, had overpaid. He bought the guitar because, in that moment, holding that instrument, understanding its history and significance, he forgot how to be a businessman. He remembered how to be human. Pawn Stars' Six-Figure Secrets. The Stephen Stills guitar wasn't the only six-figure deal in Pawn Stars' history, not by a long shot. Every so often, an item enters the gold and silver pawn shop that flips the usual script completely. These are the moments when Rick stops thinking like a reseller and starts thinking like a historian. Take the Silver Hoard. Years earlier, a man had followed his father's advice to invest in something real. He poured his savings into more than 200 pounds of silver and then waited. 12 years later, the silver market exploded. When he walked into Rick's shop, he wasn't gambling. He was cashing in. Rick ran the silver through every test he could think of, including drilling into the bars to confirm purity. Once satisfied, he didn't hesitate. $111,000. Cash. Then there was the 1932 Lincoln Roadster, a rolling monument to pre-war American engineering. Built with a 150-horsepower V12 engine, this wasn't a vehicle for average drivers. It was designed for elites who wanted elegance and muscle in equal measure. When Rick and the old man inspected an exceptionally preserved example, they knew they were looking at something special. The negotiation was brief and bold. $95,000 in cash changed hands. But the story didn't end there. In a move that perfectly captured the show's surreal charm, the seller immediately slid the cash back across the counter and used it to buy $95,000 worth of gold. One legendary asset exchanged for another in a single transaction. Music history walked through those doors more than once. A 1961 Gibson SJ Les Paul arrived carrying a legacy few instruments could match. It had belonged to Mary Ford, wife and musical partner of Les Paul himself. Together, they'd written 16 top 10 hits between 1950 and 1954. Les Paul's solid body guitar design would go on to define the sound of rock. This guitar wasn't just associated with that revolution, it was part of it. The seller wanted $250,000. Rick secured it for $90,000, the largest guitar purchase of his career until Stephen Stills came along. When Pawn Stars lose big for every smashing success, there's a painful lesson in the ledger. Rick Harrison, Corey, and the old man all learned that experience and instinct can't protect against every mistake. Sometimes the history walking through those doors comes with a hidden price tag. It started in the 1970s when cubic zirconia first hit the market. Rick admitted to getting burned early by the flashy synthetic stones. Back then, the buyers barely knew these imitations existed, let alone how to spot them. He estimates he lost nearly $30,000 on mistaken purchases. A fortune at the time. Even Corey fell victim to youthful overconfidence. During his early days working the night shift at 18, he bought 6 fake Rolexes in a single week. Once word got out that he was an easy mark, sellers lined up to test him. $4,000 gone on watches that were basically worthless. Sometimes, high-profile names couldn't protect investments either. Remember Vic Flick, the legendary studio guitarist who played on James Bond soundtracks and worked with Paul McCartney? Rick bought his 1961 Fender Stratocaster for $55,000. When it went to auction in 2014, it sold for just $25,000. So a musician's fame doesn't automatically translate into collectible value. Classic cars offered their share of misadventures too. Rick purchased a 1964 Austin Healey Sprite, drawn in by its sleek British appearance. The engine refused to start, but the seller dismissed it as a dead battery. Rick took him at his word. Thousands in repairs later, the car's charm didn't translate to profitable resale. At the top of the loss list is what Rick calls his roulette, where multiple high-ticket items were sent to auction after failing to sell in the shop. Vic Flick's guitar was part of this, alongside a first edition of A Christmas Carol, a 1960s Spacelander bicycle, and a motorcycle that alone lost roughly $29,000. Even a seasoned expert can't win every bet. Priceless treasures, pawned $85,000. That's what Rick Harrison paid for a guitar. But here's the twist. The seller admitted that number was higher than his bottom line. Rick Harrison, the man who built an empire on lowball offers, overpaid on purpose. And the reason why reveals something television never quite captured about who he really is. The case that walked through the gold and silver pawnshop doors looked ordinary enough. Inside was a 1941 Gibson SJ200, one of the rarest guitars ever made. Gibson only produced these from 1938 until World War II shut everything down. Maybe a few dozen exist today, but this one carried something extra. It belonged to Stephen Stills, co-founder of Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, a man inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice in one night. The seller had documentation. A signed bill of sale proving beyond doubt this instrument had been held by one of rock's greatest musicians. Expert appraisal landed between $95,000 and $120,000. The seller wanted $110,000. Fair. Reasonable. No room for Rick's usual tactics. Watch the footage, and you'll see something rare. Rick Harrison conflicted. One moment he's calculating margins, the next he's somewhere else entirely. A man who recently lost his son Adam. A man holding an object that represented everything his empire tried to claim. Connection to greatness. Connection to history. Connection to something that actually mattered. The negotiation moved fast. $90,000, $95,000. Then Rick offered $85,000, and the seller accepted immediately. Rick overpaid because in that moment, holding that guitar, on understanding its history, he forgot how to be a businessman. He remembered how to be human. That's what people forget about pawn shops. Yes, they're about negotiation and profit, but underneath, they're about objects carrying the weight of human experience. Every item crossing that counter has a story. Someone made it. Someone loved it. Someone needed to let it go. And someone else decided it was worth preserving. The 1941 Gibson SJ200 sits somewhere now, hopefully being played, its voice still carrying echoes of craftsmanship and revolution, and one unforgettable day when money became irrelevant. Would you sell a piece of the past for the right price, or protect it at any cost? Drop your thoughts below. Like, subscribe, and check out the video on your screen. You'll want to see what happens next. But the Crossroads. After more than 2 decades on television, Pawn Stars appears to be at a turning point. The show's contract with the History Channel has officially expired. No confirmation of new episodes in the original format has arrived. The future of one of reality television's most enduring franchises is genuinely uncertain. For a show that once dominated cable ratings and turned a Las Vegas pawn shop into a tourist destination rivaling the casinos, this moment of limbo feels almost poetic. Cast fatigue plays a role. Corey Harrison has made it clear he's ready to move on, having relocated and shifted focus to other ventures, including podcasting. Rick himself has hinted that he may have reached the end of playing a heightened version of himself for cameras. After hundreds of episodes, even he acknowledges the routine can feel repetitive. There's only so many times you can perform the same negotiation dance before it loses its authenticity. And authenticity, whether manufactured or genuine, was always the show's secret weapon. Personal challenges have changed the show's dynamic as well. The death of Richard the Old Man Harrison in 2018 marked a turning point that the show never fully recovered from. His wisdom and dry humor were foundational to the show's identity. He was the anchor, the voice of experience that grounded even the most outrageous moments. His absence left a void that no amount of new characters could fill. You can't replace a patriarch. You can only learn to work around the empty space where he used to stand. Beyond the cast, broader industry changes work against long-running cable hits. Television has shifted toward streaming, shorter content, and digital-first programming. Rising production costs and declining cable viewership make it harder for networks to justify continuing shows with aging formats. After hundreds of episodes, Pawn Stars began to feel predictable. Fewer genuinely surprising finds, increasingly familiar beats. That doesn't mean the brand is finished. Rick has teased the possibility of a Pawn Stars 2.0, suggesting a reimagined concept rather than a direct continuation. Spin-offs and adjacent projects like the Pawn After Dark podcast show, there's still interest in the personalities and world of the pawn shop. For now, Pawn Stars isn't officially over, but its classic format may be. And just like that, a guitar became more than wood and strings. It became a moment frozen in time, in a decision that revealed a side of Rick Harrison few ever see. The deal was done, but the story? It's far from over. What would you have done standing in that shop, holding a piece of history that could never be replaced? And more importantly, what other moments like this are still waiting, hidden in plain sight, ready to change everything we think we know about the people and the objects that shape our world?